Associate Director at the Milken Institute Asia Center, Cho Kwan-Fing.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Zhou Guanfeng, and I'm the Associate Director of the Milken Institute based in Asia. I'd like to welcome you all to the lunch plenary. Before we start the session, I would like to take a moment to thank our sponsor and partners. We are much encouraged by the demand to be involved in this event and the deeper partnership and the programming opportunity throughout the year. None of these can be done without the kind help of our sponsors, strategic partners, media partners, who have provided both funding and thought leadership for our range of events and programs. Please join me in thanking them for their help.
We gratefully acknowledge the participation of the following organizations whose generous support makes the conference possible. We thank the following media partners for their participation at the Asia Summit. We thank the Milken Institute strategic partners for their year-round support of our work around the world. Please welcome to the stage the Honourable Gillard, 27th Prime Minister of Australia, in conversation with President of the Milken Institute, Richard Detizio.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us for what will be an exciting, interesting conversation. So let's start with this speech that everyone knows, the misogyny speech. It's been 10 years. Rate for us the progress women have made over this decade, and which sectors do you feel more optimistic about, and which ones have a lot more work to do?
Okay, I think we've got to start by saying, given it's the 10-year anniversary of the misogyny speech, I'm making it compulsory for people to say you don't look a day older, so if you could start with that. On progress, I mean, it's obviously hard to summarise progress around the world very quickly, but I do think in many places around the world we are now having the conversation we used to ignore. So when I was Prime Minister, the analysis of my Prime Ministership was that nothing about my Prime Ministership was explained by gender, nothing about its reception, its reporting, the things that happened. Now, I think we are very knowing about how gender interacts with the reception of women in public life. To take one example of that, when Kamala Harris was announced as the vice presidential candidate with President Biden, President Trump said, "Oh, she's a nasty woman, no one likes her." And people immediately flooded the airwaves saying that's just a sexist trope that women who exercise power are nasty. I don't think you would have seen that 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So we're having the right conversation, and I'm a big believer, whilst that sounds like a humble thing, I'm a big believer that you can't fix things unless you can name them, see them, analyse them, categorise them, and then ultimately develop the evidence-based strategies that will change them.
Mm-hmm. So many of our participants watching at home and here in the audience are from corporations. Many corporate initiatives over the years, from affinity groups to the lean-in clubs, they seem to task women with solving a problem that they didn't create.
Yes.
And often we gather everyone in the room to come and admire the problem that they live every day, and then they go back to their day jobs. So how do we flip the lens on that and create real policies and places for inclusion?
Well, I think it does come back to this evidence-based piece. I think one of the issues with gender equality is everybody thinks they know. It reminds me of my time when I was Education Minister in Australia. Everybody thought they knew what the national schools policy should be because they'd all been to school. So you'd be, visiting communities, people would rush up to you. They were obviously, 50, 60, 70. They would say, I went to school, so I know the education policy should be X. It's a little bit more complicated than that. And in gender equality, I think a lot of people of goodwill have thought that they knew, but they've created a lot of programs that are about for women, about changing women, rather than doing the deep analytical work to say, what are the structures in our business that are holding women back? And also, what are the stereotypes that are holding women back? So to give just two examples of that, your informal definition of merit, not your formal definition of merit, but your informal definition might well have a lot to do with presenteeism. So pre-COVID, you might have said to yourself, at least in the back of your mind, gee, the person who's in here at 7 in the morning and still here at 10 at night, they are really, putting in. A woman in a family formation stage is unlikely to be able to acquit those hours. So you've baked in a gendered characteristic around what merit is. You're not looking at the outcomes of the two workers, you're looking at something else. Stereotypes, we know that if men are pushy, questing, looking for the next promotion, looking for the next opportunity, that will be received as he's a go-getter, he's one to watch. If women are like that, because we've all got sexist stereotypes in the back of our brain, people will say, she's too ruthless, she's too hard-boiled, she's too difficult to deal with, and it will count against her. So really, I think to change all of this, we've got to do that deep analytical work around the structures that are holding people back, and then look at how stereotypes are playing into all of it.
There's been study after study in the United States around performance appraisals, and some 70% of the time a woman's personality trait is referenced negatively in a performance appraisal, unlike men, which are really just on tasks. In business, we talk a lot about the gender pay gap, absence of women in senior-most levels of organizations. And while there's been some modest change, in 2002, so 20 years ago, 7 women CEOs were leading Fortune 500 companies. And in 2022, we've made the remarkable progress that it's 44. So given just the complexion of the workplace and workforce, that's woefully inadequate. Why are we still talking about this some 50 plus years after the, quote, women's movement began, that this is allowed to still unfold the way it does?
Yeah, it's frustrating, isn't it? And the World Economic Forum tells us that at current rates of change, it will be around 130 years before we hit gender equality globally. So I'm sure you and I are trying to do our best to eat our vegetables and stuff, but I don't think we're going to get there to see it 130 years away from now. I think there's a series of things that help explain the slow progress. One, we talk about waves in the women's movement deliberately, and I think the levels of activism actually do crescendo and then fall away, crescendo and then fall away. So we haven't been involved in the task at the level of effort and as continuously as we should have been. Second, I think this absence of using an evidence base, which is what we're all about at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, has taken us down many sort of byways and into many sort of circular patterns, but we haven't seen the big advances. And I think we're also at that hard bit now where, most big businesses have already done the obvious stuff. You know, I reflect back when I first was looking for an opportunity in the law. My original qualification was a lawyer. It was very common then for women law graduates to front up to an interview with a law firm with 3, 4, 5 male partners doing the interviewing. Now, none of the big global corporations these days would say to themselves, right, we're going to field a 5-person male interviewing panel. We're over all of that. But what we haven't done is the more analytical work to take us to the bespoke barriers. And so to give an example from the law, one legal firm that we've been in contact with at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership is a litigation-based firm. And so the people who get noticed to move into partnership are people who have done good jobs on blockbuster litigation. There's only so many blockbuster cases a year. Most of it's garden variety. There are a few blockbuster cases. And the way that the teams were being mobilised for the blockbuster cases is the partner in charge, usually a man because the partnership was very male, would go out and would pick who was going to be on his team, and was tending to mobilise teams of people that kind of reminded him of what he was like at an earlier stage of his career. So predominantly male teams on the blockbuster litigation. The intervention there was to put to hire someone who was not a partner, who was responsible for mobilising the teams. So they knew we need to field a team for X litigation. This person curated the team. And that intervention changed the rates of women coming through for partnership because they were getting fairer access to the blockbuster litigation. Mm-hmm. Now, that's not the kind of thing you're going to get yourself to if you're thinking to yourself, the intervention at my business is more women's empowerment programs, so we'll send some of our senior women on some conferences. This is a women's confidence problem, so we'll send them on conferences that help bolster their confidence. You'll never get there if that's the strategy you're using, and they are very common strategies.
But that goes back to what you said previously, that we're busy fixing women from traits they don't have. And I think all this time later, hasn't it been too much carrot and not enough stick? I think that we're still talking about it because organizations want some sort of cookie for participating in a DEI journey around women and other minorities, but there's no negative consequence for not moving the needle.
I think that's true, and I mean, I think there is a negative consequence. It's just not as easy to surface and shine up to the light as perhaps we need it to be, which is we do know from the research now that more diverse teams make better decisions, and so if you are not valuing that diversity, then you will miss things. And I remember on this journey about women on corporate boards, there was a chair of a board, very major global company, only one woman on the board. They were thinking about a multi-billion-dollar acquisition. The board was generally in favour of it. The woman hadn't spoken, and he made sure that she came into the conversation and she raised the arguments about why this was really a dud deal, and they didn't do it. But it just goes to show if you don't have inclusion and diversity, you are at risk of making worse decisions. But it's hard to measure and quantify that. Mm-hmm. I think in this world where there is so much pressure for talent, a real war for talent, and in this world where for consumers-facing businesses, consumers are much more looking through to see whether corporations actually live their values or just have them on a sort of poster in the office and on the back of the letterhead, I do think there will be more obvious penalties for businesses that are just paying lip service to equity, diversity and inclusion generally, and particularly to gender equality. Mm-hmm.
So let's pull the lens out a little bit, because the Global Institute is just that, it's global. Millions of women and girls are missing out on access and opportunity through government policies which restrict the same. There's conflict and displacement, and the ever-worsening climate crisis is only going to exacerbate that. How do societal expectations of traditional gender roles restrict real progress across the world? And when you see flare-ups, like you're in the United States, post the overturning of Roe, what's going on right now in Iran around the hijab, like, Is that sustainable? Are those episodic moments sustainable towards a movement, or does it have to be parsed out differently across the planet?
I think the strategies for pursuing gender equality will be customised to place, but they will have some things in common. And let me just explain that. I have a book coming out now around the 10-year anniversary of the misogyny speech, but the last book I was involved in, I co-authored with Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who's the head of the World Trade Organization. And we delved into all of the sort of science around women's leadership and interviewed women leaders around the world. And to take an example, we interviewed Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the first woman to lead a nation in Africa. She was president of Liberia, a war-torn country, a very poor country, and her own life has a great deal of poverty and disadvantage in it. We interviewed Erna Solberg, who at that stage was Prime Minister of Norway, one of the richest and most gender equal places on earth. And at first glance, you'd say to yourself, what on earth could these women have in common? You know, it's impossible, isn't it? And yet when we talk to them, many of the manifestations of sexism on their leadership journey had been the same. They had been about being judged on appearance, a disproportionate interest in family structures, being underestimated when they walked into a room, not being received with the authority that the various titles should have given them. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf talked about going to a meeting of the African Union. She was in that room as of right, as a president of a country, but she still knew there was an additional hurdle that unless she gave a really great speech, she was going to be dismissed. And so sexism has global manifestations, but the starting point is different in different countries. And so in many parts of the world, we're still fighting the struggle as to should girls be able to go to school, or at least should they be able to go to secondary school, or should they be forced to drop out, go into early marriage as they hit adolescence. Many parts of the world we're fighting for women's rights to be in the workforce, to control their own property, to choose who they're going to marry, to manage their reproductive choices. And so there are differentials about the starting point, but I think there's a commonality about it in terms of the things that women face.
Mm-hmm. So we're very excited to have everyone back for an in-person event post-pandemic. I think in many ways the pandemic kind of ripped the Band-Aid off for a lot of women. Once childcare was unavailable, schools were closed. Women in the United States left the workforce in droves and have just very tepidly started to come back. They're still probably 3 to 1 out of the workforce than before the pandemic began. Again, like when we think about what can we collectively do to mitigate this crisis, which has now bled into some 51% of women post-pandemic are reporting mental health issues? It's becoming a crisis around the world. So how do we think from a policy perspective that the governments can kind of come in to this fray and do something curative?
Yeah, we've certainly got to do different things. My one statistic I very clearly remember from the days of the pandemic is in the first big lockdown in the UK, there was a survey undertaken which showed in male-female couples with children, male-female couples with children being homeschooled, where both of them worked full-time and she was the higher income earner. Even in those couples, she disproportionately stepped up to the extra domestic labour caused by lockdown and homeschooling. So these choices are not economic choices. They've been put over time as economic choices. A male-female couple, if he's earning more and, the labour is needed at home and someone's career has to give, it makes economic sense for her career to give. But actually, when you see statistics like that one from the UK, this is about gender norms and roles, not about rational economic choices. And I think as we move beyond the critical days of the pandemic to where we are now, we've really got to look again at women's labour force participation and what makes it possible. And that takes us to better government regulation of things like paid parental leave, for men and women, so we can have better models of shared care right from the start. It takes us to childcare arrangements, and in many parts of the world that is still something that families have to make up for themselves. There aren't government policies that support childcare. And then I think women are increasingly saying to themselves, well, if this isn't a fair journey all the way through, why should I stick it? You know, why should I put myself through years of bro culture to try and get to the top of this business? If it's going to be that hard, then I'm going to make some other choices. And there's certainly some data that's suggesting that women are moving to portfolio-based careers earlier in life, and perhaps earlier than they should, just because that sort of ultra-male culture of the C-suite has worn them down. And so I think we've got to be talking about those cultural pieces as well as the big regulatory government platform pieces.
Mm-hmm. And I think the historically male culture inside every organization has made child rearing a women's issue, and therefore benefits around that are a women's issue instead of thinking about parenting, where both genders would participate. When we think about you and your career, you were the first and still only woman to have ever been the Prime Minister of Australia. Is that representation ever burdensome in some way?
I wouldn't say burdensome. There was a phase of my career where, I'd left politics, I took up a number of international engagements, I'd be travelling around the world and people would rush up to me and say, oh, the misogyny speech. It's like, that's lovely, but, I was in politics for 15 years.
Do they make you recite it again?
Yeah. No. In politics for 15 years, I was Deputy Prime Minister for 3 years, I was Prime Minister for 3 years, and apparently it all comes down to one speech. So that used to frustrate me a little bit, but I'm kind of at peace with it now. But I don't experience it as a burden. I'm conscious that it's a responsibility to take what I've learned about women's leadership and to make sure that what I've personally learned and to make sure that it can inform the experiences of others. I'm someone who believes only you look back so you can do things better for the future, and my political career is well and truly over, but I think I can look back and perhaps help prepare people for a better future for women in leadership, and that's what led me to found the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London, and I'm now delighted we've got a sister institute at the Australian National University in Canberra, and I do hope we can work with people in this room and beyond to make a real difference.
Okay. So I see that we're almost out of time, so I want to go through just a couple of very quick lightning round questions.
Uh-oh.
Okay. So who do you consider a role model or mentor, and what did you learn about yourself through your relationship with them?
A very strong mentor of mine was a woman called Joan Kirner. She was the first woman to be Premier of the state of Victoria, and I was personally close to her and her family. And I think I learned from her some things about resilience and humour that I've taken with me.
Okay. What world leader, past or present, most surprised you and why?
Most surprised me? Oh, that's actually a great question. I would say Chancellor Merkel, who I guess surprised me with her warmth and way of making sure I was included when I was new to forums like the G20, and that's not her TV image, I don't think.
Mm-hmm. What's the trait you most dislike in other people?
The not listening, having ended up in a world of men for many, many years, and I still go into forums that are predominantly male, the sometimes inability to listen and respond as opposed to say what they were thinking of anyway, that frustrates me.
Okay. And this last one, what do you know about yourself for certain today that you didn't know 10 years ago when you made that speech?
Oh, I know for certain that I can use the skills and things I learned in politics in multiple ways. When the music stopped for me in politics, there was this time when I thought, what next? you know, and you just look at this empty ocean of a diary, and I hadn't had an empty diary for decades and decades and decades, and you're asking yourself the question, how can I find a sense of, I always had a sense of purpose, but how can I pursue that sense of purpose in a new way? And I'm very confident now that there are many ways in which I can still pursue that sense of purpose.
Well, you certainly are making an impact. Well, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today.
Thank you. Thank you.